PAX West! How's it going? One more time, let's get excited. Before I introduce myself, let me just say, wow, 3 p.m. on the last day of PAX West, and you have all turned out to hear this little panel about how to think about video game stories. That's dope. Thank you all so much. It means the world to us 3 up here, so thank you for that. Now let me introduce us. My name is Aaron Suduiko. These are my friends Dan Hughes and Nathan Randall. We're all from this little element called With a Terrible Fate. Anyone heard of us, by the by? A couple. Wow, all right, that's great. Awesome. Yeah, we're just getting started. With a Terrible Fate does 2 things. First, it thinks in rigorous ways about how to analyze and study the stories of video games, both video games quite generally as a storytelling medium and the stories of specific games. We also do some consulting work on turning your great stories into great video game stories. So for the devs in the audience, that's something that we can do for you. And so this panel today, I'm really excited about because basically it's the value proposition of what we're doing. You've probably heard about video game theories if you talk with your friends or go on the internet at all, Reddit or any other sort of site about video games. So we're going to be thinking in a pretty precise way about what it means to have a theory of a video game and how we can maybe do that in better ways. We're going to be talking for about an hour. After that, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we're the last panel here in order to take questions, even though that'll be over an hour. If you have to go, we totally understand, but we encourage you to stick around and keep the discussion going. So thank you for that. Let's get right down to it. So, game theory. What's a theory? What are we actually talking about when we say that we have a theory of a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne or anything else like that? That's the one other thing I should say. We'll be spoiling some games, but they're all old games, so hopefully you're okay with that. But we'll be talking in depth about things like Dark Souls, Undertale, Mass Effect, so I hope that doesn't cause any of you to run out of the room screaming. Please don't. That would be very sad. When you're thinking about what it means to have a theory of a video game, you want to be thinking about actually 3 questions, because oftentimes people just ask, what is a theory? A theory, regardless of what area of inquiry you're talking about, is really just an abstract way of thinking about things and trying to make more sense of it. So defining just a theory in the abstract is not very useful for any particular reason. What you want to do, I think, is start with the goal. When you're building a theory, you have a goal in mind. Our goal is to develop new ways of understanding the stories and worlds of video games in illuminating ways that the average person playing a game might not notice without the theory behind them. Once you have that goal, that can determine the process that you go about in building a theory. That's the act of theorizing, with the goal of being responsive to whatever it is you're ultimately trying to do. And then it's only once you have the goal and the process in place that you can step back and say, all right, given that this is what I want to do, this is how I'm doing it, what does a good theory look like? And just by pulling those 3 questions apart, I want to suggest to you, we can already distinguish 4 different kinds of things that are commonly called theories of video games. 3 you'll be very familiar with, you see them online all the time. The 4th is what we're trying to do on With a Terrible Fate, and hopefully by walking through the first 3 kinds of theories, you'll recognize that there actually really is a gap in the kind of theory that we see online, and this is the gap that we're trying to fill. The key thing that we want to emphasize is all of the theories we're going to be talking about have their place and do interesting things, but oftentimes I think when I look at these theories, the theorists are representing them as doing something, serving a goal that is different than what the theory actually does. So we're going to be talking in some depth about what lore theory is best suited to, what application theory is best suited to, what recalcitrant theory is best suited to. I'm going to suggest that none of these really get to the core of understanding a video game story and world on its own terms, and so that's what we're going to try to do with this 4th kind of theory called Objectholism theory. After I explain these to you, I'm going to leave, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nate and Dan to talk about how we can integrate player experience into our theories in meaningful ways, which I really think is the next step in building a theory of video games. Let's dive into lore theory. Anyone here played this little game called Dark Souls? How about Bloodborne? All right. Who knows about these games, even if you haven't sucked it up and played them? All right, good. That's more of what I was looking for. Great. So if you know anything about these games, besides the fact that they're really, really hard, you probably know this interesting thing, which is that it's very easy to play through the games and completely miss their story. So it turns out that Dark Souls, for instance, which has spanned 3 full-length games and for 6 DLCs, I want to say. It has this vast, elaborate story and world and mythos spanning multiple ages, but you can sit down and play through every one of those games and DLCs, and if you're not paying attention, you can miss all of that. Because oftentimes the story is hidden in unexpected places. So Dark Souls is a great example because a lot of the history of the game's world and knowledge about the game's characters is hidden in things like item descriptions. So what do lore theorists do? They basically try to do research to cull all of that information about the history of a game's story, its world, and arrange it in an easy to understand, often chronological way, and present it to you, the player. With the hope being, these games are interesting because you can play through them while missing the story, but if you look at this great lore theory and then go back and play Dark Souls, you can appreciate it all the more in virtue of having this theory in hand. Oftentimes, too, games will have a variety of different possible outcomes. Games like Dark Souls have multiple endings, right? And so something else that the lore theorist does is try to make sense of all of the possible narratives of a game, which will oftentimes in practice involve determining what is the canon ending of a game. So you've probably heard this term, right? And typically how it's interpreted by lore theorists is whatever ending of the game is licensed as the true ending, oftentimes by the author of the game, whether you want to think of that as the developer or the creative head or whatever, which is oftentimes why, if you're talking about a game like Dark Souls, you'll be citing tweets from Miyazaki or something like this, saying like, yes, this is the canonical interpretation of the game. Lore theory is great. It's great for understanding the events of games like Dark Souls, and when we're thinking about understanding games on With a Terrible Fate, we consult lore theorists' work all the time. Because, again, it's just so hard to organize and understand all of the events of a game like Dark Souls. But I think there's a problem when you're trying to say that lore theory is actually a way of understanding the game itself on its own terms. And the reason for that is that it's beholden to authorial intent, like I just said about these canon considerations. Lore theory in practice tends to be much more concerned with whatever the author of a game takes to be the true understanding of the game, as opposed to whatever events the game is expressing on its own terms. Now, you might be wondering, Aaron, aren't those just 2 ways of saying the same thing? Isn't the truth about a game just determined by whatever the author says that they were trying to do with it? No, that's not true, and I can give you a very simple example to show you why those 2 things come apart. So, who here has heard of a little series called Harry Potter? Not video games, but okay, good, yes, many, great. You might know that J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, has been very vocal about tweeting what she thinks is true in the world of Harry Potter. And so we know things that we wouldn't know from the book, like for instance that Dumbledore is gay and that there was a Jewish school for wizards and things like this. Great, you might think. We're learning all these new things about the Harry Potter stories. But consider this. Here's a fact about the Harry Potter stories. Harry did not end up marrying Hermione. He ended up instead with Ginny Weasley, the sister of Ron Weasley. But Rowling has tweeted saying, oh yeah, Harry actually should have ended up with Hermione. I think that's how things really should have gone. And so you might end up analyzing that in whatever way that you want to. The only point I'm trying to make is that here is a clear situation where the author's intent and understanding of her story has pulled apart from the story itself. Because looking at the Harry Potter books, right, it's just a fact that Harry did not end up marrying Hermione. But the author of those same books is saying that he should have. So that's an example for why what the author was trying to do with the game isn't always the same thing as just what is represented by the game itself. And lore theory in practice often ends up homing in on what the author was trying to say versus the artifact of the game itself. This is why, for example, Bandai Namco, the powers that be behind Dark Souls, can run contests offering literally thousands of dollars for people to basically just hypothesize about what their authors had in mind when they were designing the world of Dark Souls. You're targeting here the author's intent and not the game itself. Let's move on. Application theory. The idea here is very simple. You have some kind of pre-existing framework way of thinking about the world, whether that's literary criticism, or feminist theory, or queer theory, or religious studies, or a particular mythology, and you're imposing that framework upon a game in order to try to bring out some new understanding that would not be apparent without the use of this framework. So, if you've heard of Bayonetta, you probably know lots of people have lots of really strong opinions on whether or not it is a feminist work, and people will undertake all sorts of feminist interpretations trying to understand, for instance, things like, is Bayonetta a strong female role model or not? So if you're not familiar with this, just Google Bayonetta feminism. You can read it for as long as you want or until you die and you still won't have read everything. So take that as you will. The goal here is really just, again, taking a pre-existing framework and hoping that by applying it to a game, you will see it in a new way. It's a really simple process. If you understand your framework, you're just saying, all right, let's look at all of the parts of Bayonetta, for example, and see whether they resonate with this feminist understanding of the world. And hopefully you get something good out of it. And it seems like a pretty good way to be thinking about analyzing games, right? Having this powerful theoretical framework in the background, and then thinking about their stories. But I want to suggest to you that, again, it sort of misses the mark when you're trying to understand and elucidate games and their stories on their own terms. Here's why. I think when you apply application theory to a game, you fall into a dilemma where either your theory that you're applying to the game runs roughshod over an important group of distinctions in the game and subtleties that actually make the game story what it is, or on the other hand, if you don't end up being reductive about your understanding of the game, you instead end up saying something completely obvious about the game. Let's talk about the first option. So say, for the sake of the hypothetical, and I'm not claiming this about Bayonetta, but say that there are some aspects of the game that are really strongly feminist in nature. You can apply a feminist theory to these parts of the game, and it seems really compelling. Like, yes, this is the right way to understand the game. But there are other parts, maybe certain storylines or side quests or characters or something, where it just doesn't seem responsive to a feminist treatment. Maybe it even seems, anti-feminist. Or something like this. So if you're trying to apply a feminist theory to the game in order to better understand it, maybe the theory will seem really compelling if you just focus on those parts of the game that are amenable to feminist interpretation. So you can write an article about that, send it out into the world, and maybe people will be nodding along with you. But the fact is that in so doing, you've ignored other key parts of the game and its story because they're not receptive to feminist interpretation. So what you've done by basically pigeonholing the entire game into your pre-existing theory is ignore key parts about what makes the game story and world what it is. That's the first problem. Suppose instead that you have a game where every single part of it coheres really well with whatever your pre-existing framework is. And let's give an example for that. Okami, has anyone played this? Heard of Okami? Great, awesome game. I love the hell out of Okami. Here's something that you can look online and see a lot of articles about. Shinto influences in Okami. The Shinto religion, people want you to know, have a huge influence in the story of Okami. And at first glance, that's really interesting, except the entirety of Okami is just a reimagining of Shinto myths. And so you're in this interesting situation where it's certainly true that Okami has Shinto influence because the entirety of the game is just telling you a Shinto story. But if you were already familiar with Shinto religion prior to reading this article, if you played Okami, that would just be obvious to you. That wouldn't be telling you anything new about the game or its story because your familiarity with the pre-existing framework would make it obvious that this is a game where every single component of it is reflecting that framework. On the other hand, if you didn't know about Shinto before reading this article, it might be interesting to you, but it would be interesting to you because it's teaching you something about Shinto. That is to say, it's teaching you about the framework that's being applied, and then, again, whatever it's saying about the game is obvious because now you have the framework in hand. So, all of that is a way of saying, in application theory, if understanding is conveyed to the person being told the theory, that understanding is understanding about the pre-existing framework. Again, not about the game itself. So that's the goal, and we need to be clear about that moving forward. Let's go to the third kind of theory. Sigmund Freud, what are you doing in the video game convention? You slide. No, there's a reason. There's a reason. So Sigmund Freud was a big figure in the 20th century, and we need to be grateful to him. It's true because he was basically the father of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, all of these great ways of helping people with serious mental problems to still survive today. But Freud also had some really interesting theories about what was going on inside your head. Here's an example of that. When you go about your day making decisions, Freud says, everything you do is guided by the desire to kill one of your parents and have this relentless sex with the other one of your parents. Now you might want to say to Freud, if he was in the room, Freud, actually I don't think that and I don't want to do that, so you might want to go back to the drawing board on some of these theories. Freud has an answer for you though. He says, actually my theory explains that because you see, there's this other thing in your mind called the subconscious, where all of these horrible desires, like the ones I just talked about, live. And because they're so horrible, when they come across your conscious mind, the things you're aware of, you just push them down into your subconscious. You're in denial about them. You repress them. And so that's where the desires are living, somewhere where you could never be aware of them. So the fact that you're saying you don't have those desires, Freud would say, is actually further evidence for my theory, because you're just in denial about them. I hope that sounds fishy to you, because I think it's a deeply suspicious way of theorizing about anything, let alone about the human mind. And so that's what I want to illustrate as the key problem of this third kind of theory called recalcitrant theory, which is basically as survivable as a cockroach, because it's literally built to resist any kind of evidence that could potentially speak against it. Why would we ever build this kind of theory when we're thinking about video games? Well, I think it's actually a deeply sympathetic desire that drives this kind of theory building for the following reason. So, we think a lot about our personal experiences playing video games, right? Because games are just so interactive. They invite us to integrate our own experiences with them into every aspect of how we see the game. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. So far we've been looking at a few different methods of theorizing about video game stories. We've seen lore theory, application theory, and recalcitrant theory. And we've seen that, while each of them zeroes in on something that's certainly worth theorizing about with respect to the stories and worlds of video games, they don't quite get at the heart of what it is to illuminate the story and world of a video game in more depth and a way that actually matters to understanding the game as a player. So what we're trying to do is develop a fourth kind of theorizing about video games on With a Terrible Fate, and we're calling that Objectholism. And we call it Objectholism in reference to the object that we're theorizing about, which is not just the story of a video game in terms of mere events, like lore theory thinks about, not just the broader themes that the game engages, like application theory is concerned with, and not just player experience, like recalcitrant theory considers, but rather the object that consists of everything from the story of the game to its world, sometimes even to the console on which it's represented, and to the experience of not just one, but many players. The theory that we're trying to create is holistic because it looks at all of the various aspects of the object as data that any theory about a video game needs to both accommodate and explain. This is again different because if you take something like lore theory, it emphasizes only understanding the explicit events of the game and the author's intention behind those events. And if you look at something like recalcitrant theory, the player's personal experience is king. Whereas with objectholism theory, we're saying that all of these things are just equally weighted data that we want our theory to accommodate and explain. And it's going to count as a point against that theory anytime there's a given datum for a video game that it can neither accommodate nor explain. Now, what this means is that when we're building an object-holist theory, we're building a theory that, unlike recalcitrant theory, is extremely receptive to the evidence of the game that we're considering. So the goal of object-holism theory is pretty simple. We're just looking at all of the data about the story and world of a video game and trying to build the best theory to accommodate and explain that data, with the hope of ultimately being able to take that theory and understand the story and world of the video game in a new way that would otherwise elude us, were we to not have the theory. The method of theory construction then is pretty simple, and in practice it looks a lot like what lore theorists do, except we're not just looking at the mere events of a story in a video game. We're looking at all of the parts of the game, from the world to the characters to player experiences with the game, again, to things like the console on which it's on. These are all aspects of the game that we need to research as we're trying to build our theory. That means playing through the game a lot,
looking at forums, looking at game wikis, accumulating all of that data that our theory is ultimately going to be beholden to. And then ultimately, if we've done our jobs right, a player can look at that theory, look at the game, play the game, and say, yes, wow, I'm experiencing the game in a new way thanks to this theoretical equipment that I now have. Now, it's important to notice that because object-holism theory is ultimately beholden to the evidence, it's often imperfect. It's always fallible, and sometimes it's incomplete as well. What does this mean? Well, consider the broad swath of data that I just said object-holist theory is responsible for. Oftentimes, in practice, this means that if we're trying to be very precise with our theory construction, it's only practically possible to focus on a given swath of data about a particular game, rather than the entirety of all the data we're ultimately trying to accommodate and explain. And so we'll build object-holist theories about particular parts of the game that we think we can illuminate in a new way, and then hope that ultimately we can extend those theories to the other data about the game. So if you look at the work we have on With a Terrible Fate, you'll see that in practice it's about small aspects of games oftentimes. My work, for example, deals with things like the question of the avatar's identity in Breath of the Wild, or where, metaphysically speaking, the concept of humanity and sentience is derived from in the world of Nier Automata and Nier and Drakengard before it. These are very small aspects of games that are rich with all kinds of content. But the hope, again, is that by starting with this specific, interesting aspect of a game and drilling down into it with precise theory that illuminates it in a new way, we can then start to talk about this and have conversations about the merits of the theory and how well it can extend to the broader game's world and story, which emphasizes something that is really important. Discussion is just the bread and butter of how we do this kind of object-holist theory. We need to constantly be in dialogue about a theory and its merits, and where it could do better. Again, because a theory is trying to accommodate so much data that can oftentimes be about a game that has inherent contradictions in its world or its story. Paradox is a key part of many fictions. If we're trying to build a theory that accommodates all of that data, and some of the data is paradoxical, then the theory is going to necessarily be imperfect. So the question is, have we done a good enough job with the theory, even if it is imperfect, to understand the game a little bit better? And how can we push the theory to improve upon itself and to iterate and become an even more illuminating mechanism for people who are playing the game? And this, to me, emphasizes the biggest paradigm shift from how people think about theories like recalcitrant theories to what we're trying to do with object-holist theory. We're not trying to craft some perfect thought about a game, put it out into the world, and then have people basically grade us, the theorists, based on how well they like the theory. Instead, we're trying to collaborate with people, starting from the premise that we all love or are really interested in this particular game. Now let's all work to build a better cohesive understanding of the game. The hope is to ultimately build a better understanding of the game for everyone. And so fundamentally, when we're theory building, we're just trying to collaborate and build something that helps everybody appreciate the game in a deeper way. If we've done that, then everyone wins. And so the idea of trying to knock people down by poking holes in their theories or lord a theory over someone and saying, I'm smarter than you because I thought of this, just should not come to the table when you're doing theory in this way, trying to better understand the entire ecosystem of a game's story and world. And that's what we're trying to espouse on the site and when we theorize about games more generally. Now lastly, I want to leave you with two observations and a puzzle that very naturally emerge from what I've said already about object-holist theory. And this is the puzzle that Nate and Dan will be grappling with for the remainder of this presentation. So, first observation, as I've already said, personal experience of players is a key datum that we need to accommodate and explain when we're doing object-holist theory. It's not the only datum, but it's absolutely a datum because video games are interactive. That means that player experience is a key determinant of the story that evolves in a way that reader experience is not equivalently a determinant of the way that a book story evolves. And so if we're going to understand the entire ecosystem of the game's story, we need to understand that player experience. Now here's the second observation. Two players can play the same game, even make the exact same choices in a game, and have radically different experiences. So take a game like, for example, Dark Souls. Now, suppose there are two people playing the game, me and Nate, and say that, certainly not true, except it is, I suck at Dark Souls. So I die many times. And as I go through the game, and its sequel, and Dark Souls 3, I just die many times, I get frustrated at every turn, and so my overall experience of those games is one of intense frustration and of constantly struggling to push myself to overcome that frustration. And so that experience deeply colors the narrative of Dark Souls for me. Now, say Nate, on the other hand, is just ridiculously good at Dark Souls and that kind of game. So he dies maybe, just 3 or 4 times across the entire trilogy. And so to him, Dark Souls is the story of just being a Superman and being unstoppable and facing things like demons and dragons and mowing them down. Even if we make the exact same choices, encounter the same endings across the whole trilogy, those are radically different experiences of two players. And so here, lastly, is the puzzle that leaves us with. If we're trying to build theories that accommodate and explain all of the data about a video game's world and story, including diverse player experiences, but player experiences are so diverse that they can be entirely contradictory in the way that my experience and Nate's experiences were, then how can we hope to have theories that are coherent at all? After all, it seems as if there needs to be a way for them to accommodate and explain just completely paradoxical data of different player experiences. And you might think that a little inconsistency in the data is okay. Like I was saying before, paradox is part and parcel of good fiction. But if the paradox is so deep that just necessarily any game is going to have totally inconsistent data based on just the diversity of player experiences that attach to that game, you might think that the entire project of theory building is bunk from the get-go. So, if we're in the business of building better theories, we'd better be able to find a way to overcome this puzzle. And that's what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you for your attention.
All right, so how can I build a game theory that accommodates and explains my experience playing the game when someone else can play the game, have an experience that is presumably just as valid as mine? I don't want to leave anyone out. But their experience contradicts mine in some way. What do I do in that situation? How do I theorize from there? I really want to drive home why this problem matters, and I want to do it with a personal story of mine. So my dad and I both played Undertale about 1.5 years ago. For those of you who haven't played the game, this is the first boss. Her name is Toriel, and you have the option to kill her or not when you get to the boss. I made the assumption, sadly, that I wasn't able to save her. So the first time I played through, I killed her, moved on, figured out my mistake later, and felt absolutely awful about it. So it led me to this entire theory about what the purpose of Undertale as a game is, which is to curb this initial reaction toward violence that we all have as people, right? This idea that violence might be a problem-solving tool in some way, to show just how wrong that is. But then my dad played the game, and he doggedly decided that he was going to save Toriel. Nothing could convince him otherwise, and eventually, playing continuously in this boss, getting no feedback that would work, he eventually saved her and moved on, avoiding this entire moral conundrum I found myself in. So suddenly that threw my theory up in the air. At that point, sorry, one too many. Let's go from here. Work with me. I'm back on why I should care. All right. So, restatement of my problem. How could I talk to my dad about Undertale when he had an experience that really didn't align with the one I had? And then returning to the example we talked about earlier of this video from the Game Theorists, I saw this video about 3 years ago when it came out, and I remembered from playing Majora's Mask when I was little just how dark this game was, and thinking, wow, this theory really captures that darkness. It must be right if it captures the dark feeling that I had playing this game. But then I played it again, a couple months later, when it re-released on 3DS, and I had a very different experience from the first time. Instead of being filled with that darkness, I was filled with a weird feeling of lightness from the celebration of ancestors that comes through Link putting on a mask and embodying their spirit, giving them agency in the world again. That was a powerful light experience to me that was not captured by this theory in any way. I want to introduce some machinery for how to deal with this problem that we hit of people just hitting vastly different experiences within the same game. And that idea is going to be the implied player. So the implied player is going to be our way of making sense of the set of all possible player experiences, which is, of course, gigantic. There's an infinite set of these things. What are we supposed to do with that? Turns out we have some tools to look at it. All right? So we're going to look at things in a visual way as soon as my slides start. All right. So here's my experience playing Dark Souls, say, from the beginning to the end of the game. And I'm kind of using experience in a particular way here, so I want to take a moment to define what I mean by experience. So experience is one path through a game, including the various reactions, emotional or physical or what have you, that a player has, and then what they choose to do in response to those feelings. Right? And we can also imagine that these experiences aren't equally likely. Right? If I'm playing Final Fantasy VII and I see Eris die, I'm probably going to be sad. Right? It's a fairly reasonable assumption. So we can kind of rate the probability of certain experiences happening, saying this will never happen, it's a 0 probability, or this will happen, it's 1, or some number in between. All right, then let's say Dan plays Dark Souls as well. And he has an experience that differs from mine, which we can map in a 2D way here. Right? And this experience is a different probability of occurring, and it happens with a different person. Right? Then Aaron plays Dark Souls, several people in the audience play Dark Souls, I play it again, and we all have different experiences. Eventually, ad infinitum, we can figure out what all of these experiences look like on a 2D plane. All right, we have a possibility space of all different possible player experiences weighted by the probability. That's daunting, I know, but when I say implied player, that image is what I mean. Right? So I just want to make a clear connection there, since otherwise it could get amorphous. When I say implied player, I'm talking about this 2D image. Right? Yet even still, this seems pretty daunting. Right? As soon as my clicker continues to work right. So, we're now dealing with an infinite set. What do we do with it? Well, one thing that we can talk about is once we have this, how do we use it? How do we talk about games better? How do we theorize about games better? Another topic. If we're looking at a game and we're not just taking data of every person ever playing it 1 billion times, how can we figure out what it looks like? Turns out we have some tools for that. Right, so for now, we're going to put aside this first topic. Dan's going to talk about that when he comes up here. I'm going to talk about the second topic, how we can look at a game's design and have some guess at what the implied player might look like. Cool. So let's consider some things that potentially constrain the implied player. And I mean that in a particular way, where constraint is taking some potential set of experiences and rendering those to a lower probability. These just are less likely to occur within the ecosystem of the game. All right, so 4 things we're going to talk about. Construction of the game's narrative space, control schemes, emotional responses, and then our own assumptions. Right? So let's look at the first one in a second. Oh, I need to get ahead. Over here. All right, there we go. So 1 chance. Anybody here played 1 chance? Do another poll here. Oh, we got 1. Love it. All right, so 1 chance gives you 1 chance to play through the game. It's a highly branching story. There are many endings, and the game only lets you do it once. So I played this game 3 years ago. I'm seeing a lot of laughing here. We're going to talk about this later. Anyways, so once you play through it 1 time, you're locked out of any other potential experience in the game. So what that looks like is in our implied player, this completing multiple endings of 1 chance, that's been completely taken out of our possible implied player. Unless you were hacky and played it on several different computers and hacked your own computer, which I assume most of you aren't going to do, but I'm sure there are a few of you who will. All right, so moving on to the next thing, control scheme. So for this, we're going to talk specifically about an idea called nudgy controls. Nudgy control is something I've been looking at for the past 6 months or so, and it gets really technical really quickly, so I'm going to talk about it in more of an intuitional way. And if you have more questions about this, feel free to ask me afterwards. So I'm going to motivate this with 90s platformers, for those of you who play those. Walking across a bridge in a 90s platformer is pretty hard. The game is pretty unforgiving, and if you press the wrong direction, it just lets you fall off the bridge, right? But then sometime in the 2000s, Assassin's Creed came out, and suddenly walking across bridges was super easy. If you push slightly the wrong direction, you could just be re-navigated back onto the bridge, and things would be great. Because you're a trained assassin. Why would you fall off bridges randomly? Seriously. Right, so this is the basic insight behind what nudging controls are. A nudge is an act from the game engine that takes your input and basically just says, no, that's not what you meant to do. I'll tell you, it's way better at being an assassin than this. You clearly meant to cross the bridge. We're going to do that. It's more reasonable within the story. You can imagine having this happening in two different ways, this nudging for story content. One is, well, okay, you saw the first one. The first one is a player A, which is a chance when the engine says, hey, I think you meant to do something better than this, and then helps you do that. But you can also imagine a player hindrance, character on the verge of death, for instance, who literally can't get their body to function the way that they want it to. So it takes your input, sometimes ignores it, and has the character stumble and fall over. Right, so basically the constraint here is you're taking overperforming or underperforming players, and you're just rendering those to a lower probability within your implied player. Great. On to thing number 3, which, while it's loading, I'll just motivate it a little bit. So everyone has emotional experience in playing games, or at least I hope you do. There we go, expect emotional responses. So, as I said earlier, if you're playing Final Fantasy VII, at some point you're probably going to be pretty sad. Right, that's expected, but it's not guaranteed, and that's the thing I want to talk about here. And I want to do it through frustration, which is a particular tangible way to get at what's going on here. I love this clicker, you can tell.
There's a frustration right now.
Oh, yeah, we're talking about frustration, I love it. Let's talk about it. Cool, so first let's talk about Dark Souls. Right, so Dark Souls is designed in a way that your average player is probably just going to die over and over and over again and get deeply frustrated with it to the point of probably wanting to rage quit. Here's my average guy. I was proud of myself for this. But then let's say you get your sick-ass gamer, someone not like me, who plays through Dark Souls and dies like one time, right? They're not going to be frustrated in the same way. It's important to recognize why. For them, this turned into an empowerment story. It wasn't a story about overcoming difficulty, right? And it's important to recognize that with our implied player, that a lot of people will be frustrated, but that doesn't mean we have a guarantee of everyone being frustrated, right? Another game, Last Guardian. Did anyone here play Last Guardian? Good, I love this game. You should play it. It's really frustrating. That says weird things about me, I guess. So your average person playing Last Guardian, which is about a boy controlling an AI beast to solve puzzles, you're probably really frustrated because the beast just does not listen to your instructions very well a lot of the time. Right, so they're going to be annoyed that their AI isn't doing what they want to do, the game's taking longer than they want, frustrated. But let's say that there's a trained veterinarian playing Last Guardian. Perhaps they're like, man, the animals that I work with on a day-to-day basis are a complete pain and don't listen to anything I tell them to do. Maybe this beast is actually very good at listening in comparison, so they're having a good time with it. It's important to recognize that experience isn't consistent across all players. We can kind of roadmap what experiences we think are likely, but it's important to recognize that there's variation possible, and we have to acknowledge that when creating theories. And their own assumptions can matter as well. And I return to the example of my dad and I playing Undertale here. I made the assumption I couldn't save her. My dad made the assumption she could, and it totally defined the rest of our playthroughs through this game. Right? And that's the general thing about assumptions. We don't know where we're making them unless we go look up everything about a game beforehand, and I'm sure there are a few people who do. I encourage you not to do that if you can, but do what you like. All right, so you can see that we've got two different players here. They actually investigate the implied player in totally different ways based on the assumptions that they make. And this is really interesting because it means what we think the implied player looks like defines in part what parts of the implied player we actually interact with. Great, so I talked about 4 things. I'll repeat them here, they're right on the slide. So the implied player, our way of making sense of the set of all possible player experiences, it's a possibility space weighted by probability. Right? And this brings up a cool new idea about possibility in games. We often talk about discrete story moments, we often talk about discrete mechanics, but we don't talk that often about the possibility for various experiences. Right? And of course we should be looking at this in our theories. We shouldn't just be analyzing the discrete story, we should be just analyzing how people might respond to it. All right, takeaway. The implied player allows for the possibility of certain experiences as opposed to the necessity of those experiences. This is what a lot of recalcitrant theorists miss. They take their experiences as necessary and then miss stuff from there. Great. But you'll likely notice a problem here, which is that even though we've talked a ton about possibility or probability, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about importance. Right? If a game is designed badly, someone's going to be frustrated all the time, but that probably doesn't matter that much for the story. Right? So when we're talking about the implied player, how do we avoid this problem of saying, well, this experience is likely, so we can take it for granted? And that's the most important part. Turns out this is where the fun comes in. We have to do it on a case-by-case basis. This is why this work is hard. This is why it takes time. This is why it takes talking to other people. Right? So let's look at an example of a game, Uncharted. Anyone played Uncharted? Good. Everyone should play Uncharted. It's just fun. It's a good time. Right? So I think most of you would agree who have played it that the important part of Uncharted to analyze is playing through the story. If you had some guy who just threw Nathan Drake off of a cliff for 8 hours straight, or just stood there doing nothing, those probably aren't terribly important parts of the game to analyze, even though they're perfectly allowed within the implied player. Right? There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And this might lead you to think, hey, wait, those must never be important parts of the implied player. And so we start making assumptions. We start saying, well, dying repeatedly in a game isn't an important part of the implied player, so we should analyze it. There's at least one game that clearly doesn't allow for this. It says, hey, dying repeatedly is an important part of our story. We wrote in that the undead dies repeatedly and gets reincarnated along the course of trying to accomplish his goals. Of course we need to analyze this part of the game. Another example, you may think that standing still in a game for just hours on end is not an important part of the implied player. But returning to Majora's Mask, where the moon will crash down in 3 days in-game time and destroy Termina, is clearly an important part of the implied player, even if most people never actually interact with that part. Even if very few people actually just stand there and let the moon crash. You have to analyze on a case-by-case basis. All right, so I want to return to assumptions. We talked a lot about assumptions. And to do that, I want to go back to the story of my dad and Undertale. How did I actually talk to him about this? Right? I kind of teased that I did it in some way. That my theory, which in some way would undermine the experience that he had. So I threw that away and I started talking to my dad about these things. And eventually, together, we started to notice something about the assumptions we came in with. I personally grew up playing a lot of JRPGs. I have in my mind that there are scripted sections of the game where I, the player, do something awful, and that's required to proceed through the game. So of course I thought that was the same thing with Undertale. I didn't look into anything about it ahead of time, and I fell into the same trap. My dad, on the other hand, had been playing Skyrim for the past 2 years, practically straight. His idea was, I'm the player, I have agency. Nothing happens the wrong way unless I let it. And suddenly you get to these interesting notions about how we've been trained toward violence or not. The theory of the game becomes this interesting analysis of people's tendency toward violence in different contexts, as opposed to just my limited view that this game is about teaching people that the violent response is wrong all the time. Right? So, once the clicker works, I will say something else. Our takeaway. The implied player allows for the possibility of certain experiences opposed to the necessity of those. I think this is a really important idea, and I hope you guys walk away thinking about it. But for now, we got one more thing to do, and for that, I'm going to return to an earlier question, which is how do we use this to talk about and theorize about games? And for that, I want to turn to Dan Hughes. So thank you.
Hello. How do I sound? Is it as beautiful as you look, everyone? A lot of low self-esteem, I guess. Hello, PAX West, and welcome to me theory. That's right. Once the clicker works. Oh boy. Stay tuned. Me theory. The only show at this panel that covers the most important thing in the observable universe, me. That's right, Mass Effect. The BioWare-developed darling that just can't stay out of our minds. As longtime viewers and loyal me theorists will know, we here at me headquarters take pride in the whole swath of topics that we've covered over the many years we've been tackling these games. With such mind-blowing theories like, which shot on the Citadel is Shepard's favorite? How tall are the Reapers for reals? And the less than well-received Garrus is the Arbiter from other video game. It's pretty clear that we've run the proverbial gamut when it comes to these games, and that I'm likely the biggest me fan out there. Oh, and hey, just a little note on that last theory. Look, I know a lot of you disagreed with it, all right? The idea that Garrus was anything but an original character written specifically for Mass Effect in its own universe, and that to shoehorn in some other character from a different game is taking away from it, just because there's a little bit of similarity. Namely, that they're both spiky aliens with guns. How did you miss that, guys? Anyway, look, you know, you can all just stop being so mean to me about it, because listen, I showed that theory to the Queen of England. Ever hear of her? She loved it, and told me what a good boy I am. So, you know, shove it. Sorry for that little digression there. I just, my dander gets up when people take critical shots at me. So naturally, we've covered a lot of ground looking at Mass Effect, but there's one little niggling problem that's been hanging over our heads, like so many Reapers coming to attack the Earth. It's a little issue you may have come across while playing the first 3 games, just a wee bit of a problem called, oh, I don't know, the ending? I like that flow better. Mass Effect 3's ending is one of the most controversial things to come from the world of video games since E.T. for the Atari, remember that? Gamers the world over were promised a game with so many different choices, but ended up getting a barely sensible meeting with some sort of ghostly godchild, and the choice between 3 different Kool-Aid colors, leading to a pretty lackluster bout of explosions. A god kid? Really? You got to be kidding me. No, we're going to sit in that. Well, for all of you who had the exact same experience that I had when I finished that last game for the first time, I'm here to put the puzzle pieces together and explain how something that seems so disappointing is actually one of the most brilliant endings to a game since the reveal that Mario was dead the whole time. Oh, spoilers. So before I get ahead of myself, let me give you a little context for the ending of Mass Effect 3. Shepard and the gang have been fighting the Reapers, a bunch of ant-looking robots who want to destroy all life in the galaxy, for the entire series up to this point. After 2 games dedicated to delaying the onslaught of this galactic menace, the Bugbots finally emerge from the darkest edges of the Milky Way and begin decimating the various civilizations that you have come to know and love through your time spent playing the 3 games. Shepard and friends are none too happy about this development, however, and start traveling the galaxy to recruit all the different alien races in a combined effort against the Reapers, while simultaneously working on a super weapon called the Crucible, that is believed to be the one thing that can stop the Reaper threat. Now at this point, I go more into how the Crucible is named after an Arthur Miller play, and that has some pretty hefty communist implications for the game, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. But rest assured, it's very important, and definitely on the right track. So, as you wind your way through the various star systems bringing the people together, you begin to experience the wages of war firsthand, when friends that you've known for a great deal of the series begin dying during the war effort. You have no idea how sad I was when I lost, I don't know, Liara? The blue one during the suicide mission, there you go, in the second game. For more on that, check out my 8-part video series, Why My Version of Mass Effect is the most emotionally responsive and therefore the best. Granted, having your party members die in Mass Effect is nothing new, and is in fact a major part of both the first and second games when you're told you have to sacrifice one friend and you may lose others during the suicide mission, respectively. War is hell, folks. Remember when some character said that probably in the game? I don't know. I mean, just look at the Nightmare Shadow things in the Dream Forest. You may remember these shades from my previous theory, how psychology in Mass Effect proves my own understanding of psychology. That was a great video. I went to a real psychologist's office and asked him real questions. He told me he was real anyway. So naturally, when we get to the end of the game and see that the catalyst, which is basically the key to firing the Crucible, is some sort of mystical godchild who resembles that same kid you failed to save back on Earth, we all get a punch right in our feels box. The kid explains to a beleaguered Shepard that the Reapers were constructed thousands and thousands of years ago as a solution to the organic life versus synthetic life problem that has come up over and over again over the course of the series, like with issues like the Quarians versus the Geth, how the magic-using biotics are basically just severely augmented humans tortured by their implants, and most importantly of all, how Shepard was literally brought back from the dead using an advanced cocktail of both synthetic and organic life components. Now, why the Reaper's answer to this problem is just going around killing everything every 50,000 years, I can't say. But what I can say is that the God Kid gives you 3 choices to solve this problem. You can either control the Reapers, destroy them, or synthesize all organic and synthetic life in the galaxy. All 3 choices have some major implications behind them, but I'm going to tell you that by playing these games through a total of almost once, going to Wikipedia and doing a search of organic, synthetic, and philosophy, question mark? I have come to the inarguable decision, the 100%, no room for revision conclusion, that the true ending of Mass Effect is the synthesis option. I know! Right? It's mind-blowing! Am I right? I mean, I know I am, but I like to hear what you guys say. So, I mean, really, after all the evidence I just told you about the nature of conflict between organic and synthetic life, is it any wonder that merging the two is the only option for long-lasting peace in the galaxy? Well, it really shouldn't be. Everything in Mass Effect was beautifully leading up to merging these 2 types of life, and it was clearly the writer's intent to do this from the very beginning. I mean, ever think about how the synthesis option is the one right in front of you? Literally! It's pretty sneaky, BioWare, but you can't get one on good old me. So anyway, that's the idea. Case closed. No further discussion, please. No comments either. I mean it. Don't make fun of me. I'm a good boy. Nothing quite like solving one of gaming's biggest mysteries based on nothing but intellect and my experience in the game. And if you disagree, just remember that it's all been just a theory. A me theory. So, that was a little hyperbolic, a bit of a parody. I'm sure some of you may recognize what we've been talking about. We have no ill will toward anybody clearly paradise in this little section. But I will say that it's a point that we wanted to make because a lot of times, well, let me put it this way. How many of you have played the Mass Effect series? All right, great. That was what I was hoping for. So the truth of that little parody in there was that I did actually think that the synthesis ending was the true definitive option when I played through that. And because I had such an emotional experience playing through those first 3 games, I was so devastated by what happened at the end of the game, by the story that I had created, that I didn't want to go back and experience it any further. Not that I didn't want to see what the rest of the game had to offer, but I didn't want to tarnish the story that I had made in those games. I'm sure a lot of you can sort of sympathize with that. But I was really interested because I loved the Mass Effect games and the experience I had. So I wanted to go further. What did I do? I went over to YouTube, I went over to IGN, BioWare, fan sites, forums, things like this. And I looked at the other endings. I looked at the destruction ending, the control ending, the 4th ending they added where you just sort of give up. I looked at all of these things. I looked at people's reactions to them. I looked at people's theories about them. And what that led to was coming to a better understanding of what they had experienced playing the Mass Effect trilogy. A lot of them aligned with mine, but a lot of them didn't. Now that's not to say that they weren't valid experiences. If I stood up here and continued in that egocentric sort of parody version of myself that I constructed, I would likely say, no, that's it. I'm done talking about Mass Effect, I figured it out. But that's not what we're trying to do. And so this implied player concept that we've been talking about is that broader sphere of possible experiences that Nate mentioned earlier. It's this putting together of all of these different experiences that everyone in this room has to try to come to a better understanding of a game. Now that sounds like a daunting task because it is, but it's also an important task when you're trying to honestly analyze video games to come up with a good idea of what they're trying to tell us and the experience that we've had while playing them. So take, for example, the sort of daunting task that the community can come and help with, people like yourselves and people on the internet and things like this. So like in Undertale, which a number of you have played or seem familiar with, there's an option where you can just kill everybody no matter what, and it's like, it makes you feel, it sort of shames you while you're playing it, and it makes you feel at the end that like you were just driven by boredom and obsession. And what's interesting about that is that that experience actually precludes you from having other experiences in the game. It says to you, even if you try to do a pacifist run where you don't kill anything, the game basically just shames you and saying, we know you're not really like this. And so for that, your entire experience is colored by the first one that you had. So then you can go to other people and ask them what it was like, and what was it like when you started out as a pacifist, or what was it like when you went neutral, things like this. You get a better idea of the full scope of things that the game has to offer. And that's where the community comes in, groups like all of us here at PAX West talking. And I've been out on the floor just listening to people talk about games, and it's clear that everyone at this convention obviously is very passionate about these things. And everyone is coming from a different place. And it's wonderful. It's a great way to get a greater idea of what games are trying to tell us. But, as we said earlier, the fact of the matter is that games do have an important piece. An important piece of games is this interactive experience, this personal player experience. To deny that would be monstrous. We can't do that. But, on the other end of the spectrum, only using that to analyze a game, only using that speech that I just gave you guys to analyze Mass Effect, you would hate me. Because I would tell you, if I were that guy, I would tell you in a conversation that you're wrong and I'm right because of A, B, and C. But if I'm open to changing my theory and hearing ideas from someone else who's played the game, someone who says, I had this and this experience which led to this result, I can say, oh, well, that conflicts with my experience, or that aligns with it. Let's talk about what that means for the greater themes of the game. So the solution here is sort of, like I said, a daunting task, bringing all of these things together. It's hard to do that, but here's the best part of it. There's no end goal to it, and as that may sound sort of, not super optimistic, it's actually the point of looking at art. You never really want to get to a definitive conclusion, because once that's done, you don't have to talk about the thing anymore. So if we go through Mass Effect and we figure out, that's what it is, that's the end of us talking about Mass Effect. And we don't want that. No one wants that for any game. But the more important thing that you get from all of these different experiences coming together and putting them up against the lore theories and the application theories that we mentioned, and some of the recalcitrant theories even, is that once you apply all of those things together with this idea of the implied player that we've constructed, this complete sphere of possible experience, you get what we like to call honest and well-informed analysis, where you're open to changing the idea, but you're confident that the idea that you came to has merit. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron once more just for some housekeeping things. And here he is.
Thank you all so much for coming. I hope that was helpful to you as you continue thinking about video games, their stories, talking about them. As I said, we're going to stick around and actually run some questions here in the room for a little bit, just because we have a bit of time past 4. It's 2 minutes until 4 now. So please stick around for that if you want to. Don't feel as if you have to. All I would say if you're going to head out now is everything we do is on withterriblefake.com, so I hope you check us out. We're a team of about 10 analysts right now. We're actually looking to bring on more analysts, so if this interests you, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. We have cards and you can connect with us personally after this panel and Q&A also. That's all I really wanted to say, so thank you for your attention. If you want to slip out now, please feel free, no pressure, but we're going to do some Q&A, so thank you so much for your time.